Talk Shoes. Recorded live.
Well, this is Derek Logue, and with me, of course, is Tom Madison, and we are ready for another So Clear talk today. And, I wanted to talk about the weather because, obviously, the weather's been kind of big this month. We've had Hurricane Matthew out on the East Coast, and Tom, you kind of had to deal with some storms. I guess out on the West Coast, you guys call them typhoons instead of hurricanes. And
we got the tail end of a typhoon here about a week ago. It wasn't bad, but it might have been worse had the forecast actually happened as the way it was described in the forecast.
Mm-hmm. Well, every part of the country, I believe, suffers from natural disasters from time to time. Obviously, much of the middle part of the United States, our biggest fears boil down to severe winter storms and tornadoes. People live on the coast, you have hurricanes, California, the left coast and all around generally, tend to think of earthquakes. So, obviously we all had, on the back of our mind, there's always the chance that you're going to be displaced due to some sort of force of nature. And normally, this is not something that people would normally think of as, well, this isn't an issue that's related to people who are forced to register, but in some places it is. As we've known for a very long time, but we haven't spoke about it for a long time because these parts of the country haven't really experienced much in the way of tropical storms and hurricanes. Knock on wood, we've gone a long period of time without Florida or Louisiana getting hit with hurricanes or tropical storms, but recently we had Hurricane Matthew, and it grazed the East Coast. I guess it could have been a lot worse. It mostly ended up becoming largely a flooding issue as the hurricane sort of grazed the eastern seaboard before heading back out to sea and everything. But I have a direct line to people at the homeless camp down in Miami. So, after all these years, they're still homeless. As most of you know, I visited there earlier this year. I shot video. You see the video on the front page of onesfallen.com. And since this hurricane come up, I called the guy that, called my contact. And this is what he told me. Now in Florida, I don't know if this is like this everywhere, but it's certainly the case in Miami, and that if you're a registered sex offender, a registered citizen, registered person, then you're not allowed to go to a traditional shelter. So obviously, if you're in a hurricane zone, you have hurricane shelters across your area. But if you're a registered person, you can't go to them. So the other option that they will give you is that you can, for the people in Miami, their option was to go to a nearby prison, and they would set up shelter in the visiting area of this prison. So like they wouldn't be like put in the prison itself, but in the visitors area. But still, that's a hell of a choice to give somebody, especially in a time of need. Say, well, you got two options. You can either go to prison and wait out the storm there, or take your chances with Hurricane Matthew. And some people chose to stay out and take their chances with Matthew, and some people chose to go to the prison. And from what I've heard, which I did a follow-up a few days later, the ones that came back from the prison said that they were treated at least halfway decent. But still, to me, it's humiliating, the idea that, you can't seek shelter like a regular person. You have to go to the penitentiary in order to get relief from the storm. So I certainly want to get your take on this, Tom, and how you would what would you choose if you were in this situation?
That'd be a tough call because certainly not just my life and my worry about being safe during a weather emergency or even a civil defense emergency in the future, whatever that might be. I mean, there are lots of things that can bring about a circumstances where whether weather or martial law or some other calamity, that citizens should be able to find safe shelter and be safe in that shelter without regard to their legal backgrounds or their race or their other ethnic factors, whatever it is. I mean, we're all human beings after all, and should be able to find that safety when you need to. And unfortunately, today we're seeing the beginnings of the division, that is the separating away from society of those that should be able to participate in public drills or public safety in times of actual emergencies, weather or otherwise. And yet, registered citizens, like you were getting at, Derek, are citizens that are no longer considered worth saving. It reminds me of some of the pictures I saw coming out of Hurricane Katrina back in 2005. New Orleans, I think, was where the hurricane hit. And after some of the cleanup had happened, they were going through the houses and looking for dead people, bodies laying about, and some bodies were in homes. And on the outside of some of those homes, Derek, there were scrawled messages with a paint message or something. With kind of a paint can, they'd scrawl dead body inside, and to mark the house is what they need to retrieve these corpses. And I can only imagine, half joking, but there's a serious side to it. A future kind of sprawling on a house side after a hurricane, maybe, would be a registered dead body inside, as to further distinguish a body from a registered body. I mean, the discrimination seems to be getting worse, and registered citizens like you and I, Derek, and our family members, many of us have family members or others who live with us in the household whose lives matter also and are somewhat put into jeopardy too if we allow the current trend in discrimination against our safety in a public emergency as opposed to other citizens generally. I think that's an important fact that been brought out lately.
Yeah. Well, I wrote an article way back in 2008, and we haven't touched on this subject in an awfully long time because, like I said, we haven't had, thankfully, we haven't had many hurricanes hit these areas. But I think it all started, back after Katrina, because there were lots of rumors that were going around back then about, there were roving bands of rapists and people were getting raped in the Superdome and, and all this stuff. Of course, it didn't actually happen, but, but the rumors persisted, and Louisiana had passed a segregated hurricane shelter law, and of course, Florida has also done the same. Now, I don't know if anybody else has done this, and I would certainly love to be able to talk to somebody who was ever displaced by a natural disaster, who was on the registry. But I believe that, I could be wrong in saying this. I certainly, don't hold it against me if I was incorrect. But, I think I heard years ago that people who were registered citizens weren't able to get, like FEMA trailers or any other kind of assistance when they got displaced by Hurricane Katrina years ago. And I wonder if it's like that anywhere else. So, if you've ever considered the fact that, if in the rare instance that a tornado hits Oregon and your house gets blown away, what would happen to you? Would Oregon do would they deny you services because you're on the registry or not? I mean, I don't think that a lot of people have thought about that.
I don't think that would happen in Oregon, at least in the current political climate, but I could imagine it happening in other parts of the country, certainly places I've traveled to, such as Florida, such as Alabama or Texas or Louisiana, or other places too, and there's certainly northern states that would likely do the same thing, certainly New York, Illinois, with the mine. But when it comes to public safety, hurricanes and earthquakes and whatever else in the natural calamity category are certainly things that you'd want to find public safety. But when I say public safety, I'm not talking about public safety in the sense of criminals acting out during emergencies or not, but I'm talking about public safety in the ability for a society to be able to find a shelter, whether it's a nuclear bomb shelter during a war or whether it's a Superdome in New Orleans during the time of Katrina, where you can go in and find safety away from the storm. Public safety in that sense, but we all know that when it comes to public safety, not all citizens are equal, and of course that's what this program is about. We have essentially at least a two-class criminal justice category: people that have never committed an offense and do not have a criminal record, a sexual abuse or a sex crime criminal record. They are set to a lower class status than other former criminals or other citizens in general. So when you have a calamity like I've been describing, yes, Gary, we are second class citizens. We don't get the same benefits of public safety as other citizens do. We are seen as a hurricane force of our own. We are earthquakes walking in the embodiment of a person. We are hurricanes in our person in terms of the public danger we represent. Wrongly, of course, but that's how it's seen. And so public shelters like the Superdome at the time of Katrina in 2005 were for those who wanted to escape the real hurricane, but also public safety menaces as are seen in registered sex offenders, regardless of the fact that you shouldn't be worried about them.
Hurricanes obviously aren't the only kind of natural disasters as I've spoken about. And it does remind me of another story that was a really sad story, which was out of Michigan a few years ago. Maybe you remember this one, where a homeless registrant wasn't allowed into the shelters during a blizzard and stayed on the street and froze to death. And I think that was back in 2010. I was actually briefly in touch with a family member of this person, and obviously it was very upsetting. They couldn't, and of course, the first thing that came out of people's mouths were, well, the guy was homeless, he had family, why didn't the family do anything about it? I'm like, well, they're not taking into account that, well, the family couldn't do anything about it because, because Michigan had restrictions, registrants couldn't live within X amount of, feet of something. And a lot of people don't realize, well, maybe, their family members also live within the restricted zones as well. And it takes a lot to, you moved not too long ago, and I'm sure you know this, how difficult it is to move. I mean, especially if you're moving to a new house and you're trying to sell the old house and what it takes to do all that. I don't think people understand that too well. But, they didn't want to blame the law. They didn't want to blame the legislature. They wanted to blame the family because he was homeless. I mean, what can you do in that situation when a person can't legally live with you because you're in a restricted zone? So, let's put the blame where the blame should have been, in the first place, with these laws to begin with.
Well, absolutely. It does boil down to civil rights. It boils down to human rights. It boils down to public safety rights in the sense of seeking shelter when things in the weather or in society turn in a direction where there's public danger. We should all be treated equal. We should all be treated as having a basic modicum of humanity, being seen as a modicum with modicum of humanity, and be able to be with others as equals. And it's really sad that we can find any number of stories where registered citizens are left out in the cold. You mentioned Michigan a while ago. There's that fellow that maybe alluding to was locked out of a shelter because he was a registered citizen. This is in sub-precinct that could be close to death, I think we're getting at. And any number of other cases around the country, certainly being left out in the weather during hurricanes or simply during any certain times of the year, like what is coming up on Halloween, where registered citizens, because of public safety worries about sex offenders, are told to report to the nearest jail, some cities, some counties, and or to prison or some public parking lot maybe where they can be observed by law enforcement so that the children can safely trick or treat during that holiday of October 31 and be safe because of the perceived menace that sex offenders are, whether registered or it's still in jail or released on probation or parole, that kind of thing, and still required to show up at these venues during that holiday. So, but it all boils down to a misunderstanding of the facts about registered citizens, and because the media and the politicians play it in a way that says that we are continually dangerous, we are not allowed into these facilities and so forth. We are second-class citizens. I said that once. You said it before, Derek. We are second-class citizens without the same amount of human rights or civil rights or public safety rights as other citizens. And I think that is the truth underneath all of this, is that our lives don't matter. And that is a sad thing to have to say in this kind of conversation.
Well, let me bring up, just for the sake of illustration, I will bring up a couple of things that were said, and I'm taking this off of my oncefallen.com website. Here in Cincinnati, where I live, somebody sued over the restrictions back in, I would say it was probably back around 2007 or so, for the right to stay at the emergency shelter because it was within 1,000 feet of a school, and they were denying, this person the right to get shelter. This is a quote from the Hamilton County prosecutor, Joe Dieters. He's a real douche. Can't stand him, and he's still in office. They get away with saying these things, and yet they still continue to get elected. But he says, I know it's cold outside, but we have to enforce the law. There is no constitutional right to warmth. If that's not bad enough, let me see if I can find the other quote here. I seem to have accidentally scrolled down. There was a quote that I was looking at from, in another spot. Hold on a second. Where is it now? I think I just lost it because I wanted to share this one as well. But there was a quote from Hillsborough County, Florida. This is back in 2005. So, these laws have actually been around quite a while. This is from the St. Petersburg Times, published June 16, 2005. It says, Sheriff David Gee, G-E-E, and I looked him up, and apparently he's still the sheriff there in Hillsborough County, has a message for 1,200 registered sex offenders and predators living in Hillsborough County. If a hurricane blows through, don't plan on going to one of the county-operated shelters for refuge. Make other arrangements. Most of these people, by nature of their sentence, can't be around children, Gee said. And you're going to have children at shelters, so I think the issue takes care of itself. He plans to send letters to registered sex offenders and predators, urging them to plan now for a safe place to stay in the event of a hurricane. She asked, County Commissioner Rhonda Storms asked Gee this week about the possibility of creating a separate shelter for sex offenders and predators. She asked, would I entertain the idea of having a special shelter for them? And I think my answer was no, they can take care of themselves. As far as spending resources to have some school or jail special for them, I think there are other people more needy of our resources.
Yeah, that's so it's so sad. So sad, the ignorance, and of course, coming from ignorance, out of ignorance, you have fear, and out of fear, you have violence. You know, it's ignorance, fear, and violence, and that's what the ignorance about these laws ultimately leads to. Vigilantism in the form of being murdered by fellow citizens or by cops, or being left out in hurricane-force winds where you might be killed or injured some way out and away from public safety facilities. You know, it's another way of saying in the current political sphere out there is that registered lives don't matter. Registered citizens' lives, we couldn't care less about. You might as well be turned into dog food. You might as well be turned into some kind of fertilizer because your lives just don't matter. You're not a worthy citizen. In fact, you're a tax on society. Why don't you just go away? In the future, Derek, I could see the beginnings of these kinds of internment camps where maybe initially it starts out on Halloween where on that day all registered citizens have to turn themselves into the camp for a day, you know, just to kind of get the process started. Okay, it was only for a day, October 31 of that year, but, you know, it starts getting more frequent there on out, and, you know, people getting used to the idea that registered citizens are only good citizens behind barbed wire fences. It's a scary thought, but it does really boil down to our second-class statuses as registered lives don't matter.
Well, as I'll bring up in the second half of our discussion today with the nursing home situation, the idea of separate but equal, it just doesn't sound like a very good idea. Speaking of separate and equal, which I'm sure we'll discuss this more in the second half, but, you know, I was looking back over my old notes from '08 on my website, and Louisiana tried one of these separate but equal hurricane shelters for registered citizens, and they did have they did have Hurricane Gustav back around the end of 2008, which wasn't a major hurricane, but it was enough to do a little bit of damage, nowhere near Katrina levels. They were building a shelter specifically for sex offenders, and the buildings had already been built, but they hadn't been confirmed to be used as the shelters. And Gustav blew them away, and Gustav I think was only like I want to say an F2. I'd have to go back and look. I mean, Katrina was like an F5 or something, or an E5, however they do the Category 5 hurricane, whereas Gustav was a 2. You know, she kind of on the lower end of power, but blew these things away, and thank God nobody was in them. But separate but equal really works very well. They really didn't. It seems to me like they really didn't put a lot of effort into building these things, and it could have been disastrous. You know, we could have had hundreds of people killed, you know, had they been in these hurricane shelters. And it kind of makes me wonder, what if they reach a point where they start separating us on everything, then I would be very wary about going to these shelters.
Well, it does raise questions about not just having access to public safety shelters, as we've been talking about, but also in a more generalized case, what happens when a registered citizen has a heart attack? Is on the street, is it required that we apply CPR to save that person's life? Or in another medical situation where in a hospital, do we bother giving a registered citizen a kidney transplant because one is needed? After all, he is a low-life second-class registered citizen. I mean, why waste a kidney on somebody like that? So it raises lots of questions as second-class citizens, and of course we are second-class citizens for any number of reasons. Where does it go from here? Okay, we can't go into hurricane shelters. We can't go into civil defense bunkers during times of war, maybe things like that. And now, of course, where does it go? Are we now second-class citizens from a medical standpoint? Are we second-class citizens from an educational standpoint? I mean, there are teenagers who are on the registry, college level, high school level. Are they to have their own separate facilities? Are we going back to that kind of thing where, non-registered citizens drinking fountains, and then in the corner, a registered citizens drinking fountains, and shanty towns out and away from normal communities where everyday citizens live? Leper colonies I could see coming about. Maybe in some cases in Florida, there already are the beginnings of leper colonies. But talk about separate but equal. That seems to be a possible direction this all could go into, Gary.
Well, what I hope is that, what I would like to know is that what other states may have some of these ridiculous policies in place, specifically for the natural disasters. I know Halloween laws, those are mostly localized laws. Not all of them are statewide. Many of them are local ordinances and everything. But, this is more like, this is more for emergency type situations, where people get displaced beyond their will. It's not a once a year event like Halloween and Christmas and stuff might be. I wonder how California would do, for example, if, the big earthquake hits. They're going to get a big one eventually. I mean, obviously they had, the last major earthquake was around 89, 90, something like that. It's going to happen eventually. And, what happens when people get displaced in these other states. On a smaller scale, it may be, tornadoes, flooding, blizzards, stuff like that. What policies they may have in place, and that's an answer I don't really have a question for at this time. That's something we'll have to look more into, but I mostly wanted, to give people an update because I was in talks with people there in Florida. I haven't heard from the rest of Florida. I don't know, maybe Florida Action Committee's on this. So, hopefully they can send some people down there and kind of get or find out how things went in the rest of the state, because I think Jacksonville was probably the area that got hit the worst. Miami was fortunate; they didn't really get a direct hit. They just pretty much got the southwestern part of the outer band, so they had a lot of wind, but it was not quite as much damage as in other parts of the state. So, but that's something that our movement's going to have to, to take a look at again in the near future. This should bring us into the second half of our conversation. So we'll take a brief 15-second pause, and I'll come back and we'll discuss the nursing home issue.